Fire Captain Engineering, situation critical.
All available personnel on the double. Spock with me.
Long before the streaming era carved up our screens, before Marvel owned every multiplex, before the internet could turn any fandom into an army overnight, one television series dared to picture a future where humanity had finally made it out into the stars. It hit the air on September 8, 1966. Nobody was impressed. The ratings were shaky, the budget was almost laughably thin, and yet Star Trek, the original series, would go on to become one of the most quietly influential works science fiction has ever produced. But underneath the phaser fire and the Vulcan salute sits a set of stories most people have never heard. Here are 20 strange, surprising truths about the 1966 Star Trek that almost nobody talks about. Number 1. Captain Kirk was nearly a different man entirely. Let's begin with the man who very nearly never got the job. When Gene Roddenberry first shopped Star Trek around to NBC, William Shatner wasn't even part of the conversation. The network had already fallen for Jeffrey Hunter, a leading man best known for portraying Jesus Christ in King of Kings. Hunter shot the very first pilot as Captain Christopher Pike, grave, introspective, thoughtful. Exactly the tone Roddenberry had envisioned. And then just like that he backed out. Some accounts blame his wife's disapproval of television work. Others say he simply thought the project was below him. Either way, he was done. That opened the door for Shatner. Flashier, more theatrical, impossible to look away from. His arrival on that bridge reshaped the entire personality of the show. Sadly, Hunter passed away only 3 years afterward, at just 42, never getting to witness what the franchise would eventually become. So if the captain almost never existed, what about the character who arguably came to define the show even more thoroughly than Kirk? Number 2. Spock's skin was originally meant to look demonic. The Spock audiences fell in love with almost never looked like that at all. Roddenberry's earliest notes pictured Spock with a reddish, almost hellish complexion, eerie, alien, unsettling by design. Early concept art pushed that demonic quality even further. Then practical reality got in the way, television in 1966. Most American homes were still watching in black and white, and red skin would simply photograph as murky black, the exact opposite of the effect they wanted. So the team pivoted to a pale greenish-yellow tone, subtle enough to hint at something not quite human, but light enough to read clearly on a monochrome screen. Here's the twist. Once color broadcasts arrived, that tint was so faint that barely anyone noticed it. It was the pointed ears that did all the heavy lifting. And the rest became legend. But reworking Spock's look was a minor fix compared to what came next, because one of the show's most beloved inventions wasn't part of any grand plan. It was a last-second patch for a much bigger headache. Number 3. The transporter existed purely to cut costs. Ask any fan to name their favorite piece of Star Trek technology, and odds are good they'll say the transporter, the idea of breaking a person down at the molecular level and reassembling them somewhere else. It's one of science fiction's boldest concepts. Here's what Roddenberry probably wasn't eager to advertise. The transporter didn't spring from some grand creative vision. It came from a budget emergency. The initial plan had the Enterprise crew traveling to alien worlds the conventional way, via shuttlecraft, complete with landing sequences and dramatic approaches. Visually striking, sure. Also financially impossible for a show operating on this shoestring. The production needed a cheap fix immediately, and what they landed on was the transporter effect. Glittering particles filmed against black, then run in reverse. It cost next to nothing compared to shooting a full shuttle landing. What began as a money-saving trick became one of the franchise's defining symbols. These days, physicists genuinely debate the feasibility of teleportation, and university labs run experiments loosely inspired by the concept, all descending from a crew that simply couldn't afford a spaceship model. And if something as iconic as the transporter came out of a budget crunch, wait until you hear how the network initially reacted to the whole series. Number 4. NBC called the first pilot too cerebral. Most shows get a single shot with a network. Star Trek got something almost unheard of, a second chance, but only after its first attempt was rejected outright. The original pilot, titled The Cage, landed at NBC in 1965, and the response was harsh. Too intellectual, too slow-moving, not enough action. The female second-in-command, played by Majel Barrett, was apparently more than network executives of that era could stomach. NBC turned it down flat. But, remarkably, they ordered a second pilot instead of walking away entirely. Roddenberry went back to the drawing board. Number 1 was gone. Kirk, Spock, and a punchier, faster tone took her place. Roddenberry didn't let The Cage go to waste though. He later folded its footage into a two-part episode called The Menagerie, the only Star Trek episode ever to win a Hugo Award. The pilot that got rejected became the show's most decorated hour. But even after clawing its way back from rejection, Star Trek kept testing limits nobody expected it to touch, and one actress nearly left the show before discovering exactly how much her character meant. Number 5. Nichelle Nichols almost quit, until Martin Luther King Jr. stepped in. On 1960s American television, simply showing up to work was a radical act for Nichelle Nichols. As Lieutenant Uhura, she was one of the first black women cast in a position of real authority on mainstream TV. Not a servant, not a sidekick, but essential crew. Still, after the first season wrapped, she was ready to walk away. Broadway was calling, and she handed Roddenberry her resignation. Then, at an NAACP function, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. asked to speak with her personally. He told her that Uhura mattered, that for the first time, black children were watching someone who looked like them portrayed as a skilled professional, an officer, someone of genuine standing among humanity's best. She pulled her resignation the very next day, and later described that single conversation as one of the most pivotal moments of her entire life. Number 6. Leonard Nimoy wasn't convinced Spock would work at all. Today, Nimoy and Spock are inseparable in the public imagination. But early in production, Nimoy himself wasn't sold on the character, or even certain he wanted the role. His worry centered on the ears. The pointed features, the greenish tint, the alien design. He feared it would come across as monstrous rather than compelling, turning him into a novelty act trapped in rubber prosthetics rather than a serious performer. There was also the emotional challenge. Nimoy was a trained, expressive actor being asked to strip all emotion from his performance. A total rewiring of his instincts. What changed his mind was the audience's response. Viewers didn't see a monster. They saw quiet depth underneath the logic, warmth hidden beneath the restraint. Nimoy would eventually write 2 memoirs. The first was titled I Am Not Spock. The second, I Am Spock. That shift in title tells the whole story. Number 7. The interracial kiss nearly never aired. On November 22, 1968, Kirk and Uhura shared a kiss now widely regarded as one of the earliest interracial kisses ever broadcast on American primetime television. What's less known is how hard the network fought to keep it off screen. NBC insisted the moment be rewritten so the kiss appeared forced, triggered by telekinetic aliens rather than chosen freely by the characters. The goal was to give nervous affiliates in the South a built-in excuse. It wasn't real affection, it was mind control. Shatner and Nichols had other plans. They quietly ruined every take where their heads stayed apart, leaving the director no choice but to use the footage where they actually turned toward one another. NBC got its disclaimer. The actors got the moment they wanted. Nichols later remembered receiving a letter from a white viewer in the South who admitted that single scene had made him question everything he'd believed. One kiss on a science fiction show reshaped how a man saw the world. Number 8. Fans rescued the show from cancellation twice. Star Trek was never a ratings powerhouse. After Season 1, NBC was already murmuring about pulling the plug. After Season 2, those murmurs grew louder. What happened next had essentially no precedent in television history. The audience organized. More than 1 million pieces of mail reportedly poured into NBC's offices across 2 separate campaigns. Petitions spread through college campuses. Fans physically gathered outside NBC headquarters. All of this without the internet, without social media, without any of the digital tools we take for granted today. It worked twice. NBC renewed the series for a 3rd season, going so far as to announce the decision publicly at a convention. One of the earliest documented cases of fan pressure visibly overturning a network's decision to cancel a show. That 3rd season turned out to be the weakest, underfunded, buried in a late Friday night time slot, and the show was finally canceled for good in 1969. But those extra episodes pushed the total count high enough to qualify for syndication, and that single detail changed everything. Number 9. The Enterprise model's underside was never finished. The USS Enterprise, Registry NCC 1701, remains one of the most recognizable vessels in all of fiction. But the physical model used for filming hid a secret the cameras were never meant to expose. The 11-foot studio model was painstakingly detailed, on the surfaces the camera actually saw. The hull, the nacelles, the saucer section, all lovingly finished. The underside, though, was left largely bare and rough, unpainted in places. The logic was straightforward. Every shot was framed from above or the side, so there was no reason to spend time or money finishing sections the audience would never lay eyes on. That original model now resides in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Flip it over, and you'd be staring at the unpolished underbelly of one of the most famous vehicles in the history of storytelling. Number 10, Beam Me Up, Scotty, was never actually spoken. This one stings a little because it feels like it has to be false. Beam Me Up, Scotty, is among the most repeated lines in pop culture, printed on shirts, bumper stickers, mugs for decades. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station even echoed the phrase when James Doohan, the actor behind Scotty, passed away. And yet the exact wording never appears anywhere in the original series. Not a single time. What Kirk actually says across various episodes includes lines like, "Beam us up, Scotty," "Scotty, beam me up," or simply "Enterprise, beam me up," countless close variations, but never that precise combination that became cultural shorthand. This gap between what people remember and what was actually said is more common than you'd think. Play It Again, Sam never appears in Casablanca. Elementary, My Dear Watson was never written by Arthur Conan Doyle. Even Luke, I Am Your Father isn't quite accurate. Vader actually says, "No, I am your father." Star Trek's version stands out because the misquote eclipsed anything genuinely said on the show. Language takes on its own momentum, and sometimes the story people tell about a moment outlives the moment itself. And once you realize how much of Star Trek lives in collective memory rather than reality, brace yourself, because a lot of what actually appeared on screen wasn't original either. Number 11. Most alien costumes were recycled from other productions. Star Trek's universe was packed with alien civilizations, strange fashions, unusual armor, bizarre ceremonial garments appearing week after week. You'd assume the wardrobe department was working overtime dreaming up new designs. They were resourceful more than anything. Much of what read as alien clothing on screen was actually repurposed human costuming, pulled from the studio's existing wardrobe stockpiles. Hollywood studios in the 1960s maintained massive costume warehouses, the accumulated leftovers of decades of film and television production, and Star Trek's costume team raided them constantly. Roman togas became ceremonial alien robes. Old Western saloon outfits became the clothing of distant civilizations. Vintage B-movie sci-fi suits got fresh paint jobs and new insignia. Sharp-eyed fans occasionally spotted a familiar piece, a costume from some biblical epic reappearing on an alien world, or a medieval knight's armor repainted into something interstellar. The wardrobe team had a gift for disguise, turning the ordinary into the strange. And it worked because on a home television screen, the illusion only needs to hold for a few seconds at a time. Because when it came to building an entire universe on almost no money, even the show's most iconic weapon started out surprisingly humble. Number 12. The phasers began as repurposed toy ray guns. The phaser, standard Starfleet sidearm, capable of stunning, burning, or fully vaporizing a target. It became one of science fiction's most recognizable prop weapons. It was also, at its origin, essentially a toy. The prop department's starting material for the hand phaser was a batch of plastic ray gun toys already sitting in studio inventory, cheap novelty items left over from earlier low-budget productions. The design team modified them with new paint and added detail work to make them look sleeker and more futuristic. Fans at the time noticed a slightly toy-like quality regardless. The plastic looked cheap up close and the proportions weren't quite convincing for a serious weapon. But under the right lighting paired with the right sound effect, they read as pure science fiction. Ironically, the phaser went on to inspire actual weapons research. The U.S. military has poured serious money into directed energy weapons over the decades, laser systems that are direct conceptual descendants of Roddenberry's imagined technology. A repainted toy gun helped seed a real weapons program. But not every budget-saving trick went smoothly. Sometimes it created problems the cast had to solve on the spot. Number 13. The tribbles were an actual electrical hazard. No episode captures the show's playful side better than The Trouble with Tribbles, the 1967 favorite where the Enterprise gets overrun by small, purring, rapidly multiplying furballs. It's funny, clever, and endlessly quotable. What the episode doesn't reveal is that the tribbles were a genuine hazard behind the scenes. The props themselves were simple. Synthetic fur wrapped around foam spheres, with tiny motors tucked inside some of them to create that purring vibration. Cute, sure. But under the intense heat of 1960 studio lighting, that synthetic fur turned into a static electricity generator. Tribbles clung to costumes. They stuck to furniture. They latched onto camera equipment. Crew members kept getting small shocks, and the more the props got handled, the worse it became, and this particular episode required handling hundreds of them. The crew ultimately had to develop a system for discharging the tribbles between takes and limiting their exposure to the hot lights, just so an episode about adorable fictional creatures could wrap without shocking half the cast. Filmmaking glamorous as ever. And while the tribbles caused quiet chaos off camera, the show unintentionally created something that would live permanently in pop culture vocabulary. Number 14, the red shirt trope was born here. Spend any time around geek culture and you already know what a red shirt is. The disposable character, the nameless crew member who beams down with the heroes and doesn't survive the episode. A sacrifice meant to signal danger without risking anyone the audience actually cares about. Star Trek didn't invent the disposable side character, but it gave the trope both its name and its visual signature. In the show's color-coded uniform system, red was worn by engineering and security personnel, precisely the departments most often sent into harm's way. And those red shirt background characters really did die at a noticeably higher rate whenever they showed up on away missions. Fan-compiled statistics over the years back this up. Red uniforms accounted for a disproportionate share of the show's on-screen deaths. The show never explicitly called attention to the pattern. No character ever warns anyone about the red shirt. It was a visual language the audience absorbed passively, episode after episode, until it hardened into cultural shorthand that has outlived the series itself by decades. Today, red shirt turns up in storytelling workshops, corporate culture discussions, military analysis, even academic writing on narrative structure. Not bad for what started as a simple costume decision on a low-budget 60s show. But here's where things get even more surprising, because one of the most iconic elements of Star Trek lore wasn't nearly as central as most people assume. Number 15. The Klingon weren't the original series' main villains. Ask someone to name Star Trek's primary antagonists, and nearly everyone says the Klingon, the proud warrior race, the honorable rivals who eventually become allies. They're so tightly linked to the franchise's identity that it's hard to picture Star Trek without them. In the original series, though, the Klingon were actually a secondary threat. The Romulans appeared first in Balance of Terror, widely regarded as one of the strongest episodes of the entire run, and were initially set up as the primary antagonists. Secretive, calculating, bound by their own code of honor, the Romulans played almost like a mirror of Cold War-era America's relationship with the Soviet Union. The Klingons showed up later as a more straightforwardly aggressive, muscle-driven threat, standing in, many critics have argued, for a different flavor of Cold War anxiety. Popular and memorable, sure, but they didn't dominate the original series the way later films and spin-offs would eventually make it seem. It was the movies that followed, especially Star Trek III, along with The Next Generation, that pushed the Klingon into their now legendary status. The original show's villain roster was more layered than its later reputation suggests. And if the villains weren't what people assume, neither was the method behind building its hero. Number 16. Kirk's heroism was deliberately built around defying the computer. Captain Kirk has a reputation as a man who trusts instinct over everything, who makes the impossible call, who beats odds nobody thinks are beatable. That's the core of his character, and it turns out that wasn't accidental at all. It was engineered by design. Writers and producers made a deliberate choice to use the ship's computer as a foil for Kirk's judgment. Whenever the computer spoke, it spoke in probabilities, something close to, there is a high probability of mission failure, or the logical course of action results in unacceptable losses, or there is no precedent for success. And then Kirk would ignore it. Consistently. And more often than not, he'd be proven right. This was a very specific argument the show kept making. Instinct versus data, human judgment versus machine calculation, the irreplaceable value of experience and moral courage inside a universe that resists tidy quantification. In 1966, as computers were only just entering the public imagination, that was a pointed statement to be making. The debate the show was staging, human intuition against algorithmic certainty, feels more relevant now than it did when these episodes first aired. Every modern conversation about whether artificial intelligence should be trusted with important decisions is, in some sense, a continuation of the argument Kirk kept having with his own ship's computer. He usually won. We're still working out the answer. Because underneath all the space battles and alien encounters, Star Trek was quietly attempting something far bolder. Number 17, the show smuggled political commentary past the censors. Gene Roddenberry envisioned Star Trek as something more than entertainment. He wanted the future to function as a mirror, a way to hold up the present and ask what humanity actually was, and what it could still become. In the racially tense, politically charged America of the late 1960s, that ambition was genuinely risky. Network censors stayed alert. Anything that seemed to directly touch civil rights, Vietnam, the Cold War, or social inequality risked being cut, or worse, taking the whole show down with it. So Roddenberry and his writers dressed their arguments in alien costumes. The episode Let That Be Your Last Battlefield presents a humanoid species split down the middle. One side of every face black, the other white, locked for centuries in mutual hatred and genocidal conflict over which arrangement was superior. Subtlety was not the point. Other episodes tackled war profiteering, political corruption, mob mentality, and religious extremism, all filtered through the safe remove of alien planets and distant centuries. Apparently, censors had a much harder time objecting to a metaphor than to the thing itself. It was political theater wearing a space adventure costume. And it worked, both in slipping past the censors and in reaching viewers who might have simply changed the channel had the same ideas arrived without the science fiction disguise. But not everything behind the scenes carried this much weight. Sometimes things got just plain strange. #18. The cast recorded a genuinely bizarre Christmas album. Not everything happening off camera was heavy drama or bold science fiction commentary. Some of it was pure, delightful nonsense. At some point during production, somebody floated the idea of putting the cast in a studio to record a full Christmas album. Not a polished, radio-ready release. This was camp cranked all the way up. William Shatner didn't just sing his part, he committed to it fully, delivering Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star, like some kind of dramatic space lullaby, equal parts soothing and bewildering. Leonard Nimoy, meanwhile, leaned into his trademark gravity with a spoken-word piece called Once Upon a Star, narrating it as though he were describing the birth of the universe itself. Nichelle Nichols, Walter Koenig, and the rest of the crew jumped into cheerful holiday numbers with an almost aggressive level of festive spirit. The wildest part is that this was never intended as a major release, just a quirky little promotional item for fans and studio archives. Then it disappeared for years until bootleg copies started circulating, official reissues followed, and this odd side project quietly turned into a cult holiday favorite. Because nothing says Christmas quite like your favorite Starship crew being wonderfully, unapologetically ridiculous. Number 19. The budget was almost comically small. Everything covered so far, the effects, the alien makeup, the elaborate sets, the model spacecraft, was produced on a budget that would make even a modest modern YouTube channel wince. Per episode costs shifted throughout production, but they stayed consistently tight enough that the entire crew had to get relentlessly creative. Sets got reused constantly, the same generic corridor doubled as alien planets, space stations, and Starfleet facilities with only minor tweaks. Extras were frequently crew members pulled from other departments and dressed up for the shot. Effects that would cost millions today, space battles, alien landscapes, planetary surfaces, were pulled off with hand-built models, painted backdrops, and cheap photographic overlays added in post-production. The show's entire visual identity was constructed out of clever workarounds. By the third season, the budget had been trimmed even further, and the drop in production quality became noticeable. Episodes conceived as visually ambitious ended up stripped down to little more than actors talking in a room. The script's ambition kept outrunning what the money could actually deliver. And yet, stripped of nearly everything but the ideas and the performances, it still worked. Which says something important about what actually made this show great. Which makes what happened next even more remarkable, because the real success story hadn't even begun. Number 20. The show became a phenomenon only after getting cancelled. Here's perhaps the most important fact of all. During its original network run, Star Trek was not a hit. Ratings stayed mediocre. NBC remained unconvinced. The show got cancelled after 3 seasons with unimpressive viewership and a burial ground timeslot. By any conventional 1960s television measure, it had failed. Then, starting in 1969 and stretching into the 1970s, the show entered syndication. Local stations across the country began airing reruns. College students discovered it fresh. An entire generation too young to have caught it the first time around found it in afternoon rerun slots and fell completely in love. Fan conventions began springing up. The original cast slowly began to understand the scale of what they'd actually created. Letters multiplied. Merchandise appeared. The cultural weight built quietly, then all at once, until Star Trek became undeniable, a phenomenon that grew, paradoxically, out of the ashes of its own cancellation. The first feature film arrived in 1979 with more following. The Next Generation launched in 1987 and turned into a massive hit of its own. Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, Discovery, Strange New Worlds. A franchise that was once written off as a failure has now been running, in one form or another, for nearly 60 years. By any measure, It stands as one of entertainment's most extraordinary second acts, and it happened because the ideas were strong enough, and the fanbase devoted enough, to keep it alive through every silence, every cancellation, every moment when it looked like the story was truly finished. So was Star Trek simply ahead of its time, or did it actually help shape the future that came after it? 20 facts. 20 windows into a show that looked, on the surface, like a cut-rate space adventure and turned out to be something else entirely, a vision of the future assembled out of limited resources, bold ideas, and a cast who genuinely believed they were making something that mattered. They were right. Star Trek didn't just anticipate the future, it helped build it. The flip phone owes a debt to the communicator. The tablet echoes the PADD. Automatic sliding doors, in-ear wireless communication, handheld medical scanners. All of it took root in the imaginations of engineers and scientists who grew up watching this show in their living rooms. Gene Roddenberry originally pitched the series as Wagon Train to the Stars, a frontier adventure set among the stars. What it actually became was something far more lasting. A set of values encoded into story form, carried forward across generations. The idea that diversity makes people stronger. That curiosity is a form of courage. That the future is worth reaching for. Live long and prosper.